C# 12 was released in Q4 of 2023, and with it came primary constructors. Now, the primary constructor syntax offers to simplify how you create constructors in your classes, and it could be a potential game changer. So what you're going to learn in this video is how you can get started with primary constructors, some of the caveats you need to consider when using them in anger, and by the end you'll see my review of if it's any good or not. This is unmissable if you want to level up your C# skills. I think the best way for me to explain how primary constructors work and some of the nuances that you need to be aware of is to do a live refactoring exercise. So we're starting off with this traditional class, and this should hopefully look very familiar to anyone who's done .NET for a while. So at the top we've got our namespace. The class is called homepage service. Now for this example, let's imagine that we're using dependency injection. It's all hooked up. And in this class, we want to use a dependency. So we've defined a constructor. We're passing in this I_Umbraco context factory object. Doesn't make a difference what it's doing. Now, in order to make sure that the code and the methods within this class can access this object, we then need to map it here to a private read-only field. So this can then be used throughout this class. Perfect. So the first refactoring I want to make is to use file scoped namespaces. So by putting a semicolon here, you can see that we've got rid of those curly braces and my class is now easier to read. So yep, that refactoring was super simple. However, the end result is a cleaner file that's doing exactly the same thing. And basically, this is all a primary constructor is. It's a new syntax for creating constructors that should make your class tidier at the end. Right, now let's refactor this code to use a primary constructor. So the first thing we can do here is just copy our parameters. I can paste them now directly after my class declaration. Then I can delete everything else. And in essence, this code is doing exactly the same thing as the previous example, because this parameter here is now file scoped and it can be used anywhere inside my class. So I don't need to map this to a private read-only field like I did in the previous example, because everything within my class will now have access to this. And it's this end simplicity which makes me such a big fan of the primary constructor, because any single time that you can remove a bunch of setup code from all your classes contained within your code base, the end result is going to be classes that are more focused, that has code which is just related to the business value, which means it's going to be intrinsically easier to understand what that application does. Now, on top of this, everyone hates writing boring boilerplate code, so any feature that allows me just to focus on writing interesting stuff is a win in my opinion. Now, if I look at any project I work on, I'll say that typically maybe 70 to maybe 90% of my code in my constructors simply just maps incoming dependencies to underlining private fields. And if you're in the same boat, the primary constructor is going to make your classes better. Now, obviously, sometimes within our constructors, we need to do more complicated things like add logic. Now, this is where there are a few nuances and things you need to consider about the primary constructor. So we'll look at the 5 major things that you need to be concerned of next. So switching back to our code, the first consideration is the read-only modifier here. So classically, when I've been doing dependency injection with my constructors, I'd pass something in, I'd map it to a private read-only field. Now, jumping to the new syntax, if I try to add read-only within my primary constructor, you can see I get the red squiggly line here because this is invalid syntax. And the only way that I can get a like-for-like functionality is to define a private read-only field. I can then map the incoming argument to the existing one here. Now, I'll leave it up to you to decide which one of those syntaxes you prefer. However, technically, when you're using the primary constructor, you're going to be keeping 2 objects alive throughout the life cycle of that class context. And when you're using the OG constructor, you'll only be keeping 1 object alive throughout the context of that class. So just in terms of memory and performance, the primary constructor is probably a little bit worse in these situations compared to the previous pattern. Our next consideration is also another modifier. However, this time we're going to look at required. Now, in case you weren't aware, required was released as part of C# 11, and the intention of required was to basically reduce boilerplate code and constructors when you need to create objects with public properties that have required parameters. So I'll demonstrate this with some code again. So I've got a class here, and then I've got this required property. So in order to make something required, it needs to be a public property and it needs to have an initializer or a set. Now, when I try to instantiate my object, you can see that I don't need to pass anything as a constructor. However, what I can do is pass something through my object initializer. You can see here I now got my context factory. I can say null job is a good one. So this is a pretty nice shortcut because it means historically I might have had to create a constructor, I might have had to put some validation logic within that constructor to make sure that this public prop was instantiated with the correct value. So that's what we could do in C# 11. Let's look at how we could refactor this potentially in C# 12. Okay, so I've refactored that code so you could see how you could potentially write something similar in C# 12. Now, the underlying intention is still to expose an object as a public property. So using the primary constructor, I can pass it in. Now, because we know that this is always going to be available, I can now use it as the initializer for this public property. And this code is going to do something very similar to the last one. Now, granted, those two use cases aren't 100% technically exactly the same. However, they do allow you to do roughly the same thing. And that is ensure that when anyone instantiates a class, they have to provide a parameter which will be used for that public property. Now, this is all great, and my personal preference is probably for the primary constructor syntax because it's a bit shorter. The issue that I really have is that there's no rules to stop you doing a mix and match of approaches. This means you can end up with some Frankenstein looking code which looks a bit like this. Right, let's examine this monstrosity in action. So I'm using primary constructor, I'm passing in this Umbraco context factory, and I've got this public property, and I'm using the passed in value here as the default value here. Now I've also got this required, and I've got an init here. So let's have a look at how we implement this. So I'm newing up my homepage service. I'm being forced to add in the constructor right here, but then within my object initializer, I also need to add in this prop. And if I don't do either of these, I'm going to get some red squiggly lines because there's going to be an error here, or there's going to be an error here. So obviously this code isn't great. And my question to you is that if you saw this bit of code, seeing that we're passing in a prop here, and we're passing in an object initializer here, which value are we going to get returned? The next consideration is inheritance and what happens if you want to do constructor overloading. So I've refactored my code yet again, and this time I've got a brand new constructor overload here. So you can see here that, I've got a constructor, and now I'm trying to pass back to my primary constructor this value that's been passed in. You can see here, the primary constructor parameter can't be used in this context. So obviously it's possible to do something like this. However, if I omit this line, you'll see that we get an error. So we need to pass a value back. Now it is definitely possible to do constructor overloads. So what we could do here is repass this in as our constructor. Then I can do this. Then I could pass in my Umbraco context factory. I'm then free to do constructor overloads by adding in other parameters here if I want to, and you can see the compiler is very happy with this. And it's because of these different nuances, I think if you need to create a class that has logic or different constructor overloads, it's probably going to make more sense to use the primary constructor and just use the old school way of creating classes instead. The final consideration is around records. Now the code on screen might look very similar. However, they're doing slightly different things. So in this second example here, I'm using a record type. I'm creating a class. Let's just say it's got the same name. I've just changed it so the compiler doesn't error, and I'm passing in the same dependency here. Now, the difference between these two examples is that this thing here is going to automatically create a public property. Now, I'm sure you know this, but in .NET, there's a convention around public properties that the name should begin with a capital letter. And in a record type, because we're creating public properties, this convention holds true here. And that's why when you accidentally forget to set this as a capital, you'll get the naming rule violation. These words must begin with uppercase characters. And this is the reason why some folks have concerns that primary constructors just add in more confusion, because the code on screen looks like it's doing exactly the same. The only difference here is obviously record and it's capital. However, this is creating a public property. This is creating a privately scoped property. And the only way to get a like for like would be to add code which works like this. So going back to the original point I was trying to make at the start of this video, I'd say, 90% of the time, the majority of the time, all my classes and constructors are doing is getting incoming dependencies, mapping them to private fields, and that's it. And in these situations, the primary constructor is a big win in my opinion, because it reduces the amount of code you need to write and it makes your classes easy to understand. Now, as we've seen, there's also some special edge cases. So if you want to do logic in your constructors, maybe you want to do overloads, if you're doing required, all that kind of good stuff, then you can end up with more confusing code and it can be harder to code review things. And I'd say that this is kind of a big criticism of .NET recently, because in the last few versions, they've done a lot to simplify the code itself. However, now it does mean there's multiple ways to do the same thing, which can be a burden to some devs. Now, if this is the first time you've come across this channel, then I release a video every single Sunday aimed at making you a better developer. So if you like .NET, don't forget to hit subscribe right now. Now, I don't really get paid for these videos. It takes me ages to do them. So if you have got value, keep me motivated by clicking on like. And finally, I do a newsletter every single Sunday. It's free. The link is in the description below. Now, if you do want to learn more about .NET, I have recorded a video which highlights all the latest features and goes over everything in C#12 that you need to know. So the link to that is on screen right now. Otherwise, hope you're having a great day. And until next Sunday, happy coding.